The idea is the CCP is working on a national cyber ID. It uses facial recognition across dozens of platforms to try and credential anyone who's accessing the internet. Some of the biggest social media sites like WeChat in China are in on this effort, and others which are, of course, backed by the government. But I'm assuming that this is being heralded by the CCP as a step towards online safety. But critics could easily and rightly point out that there's a lot of dangers to privacy here. So why is this a big deal, Miles?
Well, first of all, every single repressive measure Chinese government has taken is always announced as for the benefit of the people. Make no mistake that China has the world's most sophisticated dystopian internet surveillance and censorship system. The Chinese government wants to have a complete system, a totalitarian system of information control. But they realize there are some two potential weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Number one, that is, there are more and more Chinese internet users. They're using all kinds of ingenious ways to bypass the very draconian censorship system to register accounts on foreign social media outlets. For example, Twitter, YouTube, Google, Facebook, all of those are banned inside China. So there are more and more Chinese internet users who could somehow find a way to register those foreign accounts. So this basically spooked the Chinese government. They want to use this new system, this new cyber ID system, by the way, for over 1 billion internet users inside China. Everyone has it. So that is to say, if you log on the computer to register any account, and then you will be tracked, traced.
Yeah, you have to give your face, right?
That's exactly right. You have to be traced, and this is secondly. So far, the Chinese government realized the enormity of this censorship mission, so they mostly rely on all the major internet providers, such as WeChat, you mentioned, Tencent, to censor themselves on behalf of the central government. So far, they've done a great job. All the Chinese internet providers are 100% in line with the Chinese government's requests and efforts. Now, the government realized that probably is not good enough, so they want to further centralize the censorship regime by bypassing those internet providers, by creating a central kill switch at the very top. That's basically can be done through this creation of a cyber ID system nationally, so that all the censorship will be done from a central switch. And that's basically the main purpose of this cyber ID system. Now, the Chinese government tried to fake the fairness of this new system because they realized there will be some kind of a national uproar. So they put out this regulation proposal asking for a period of national comments. But when people almost overwhelmingly were critical of this measure, they shortened the period and they're going to put it into implementation within a matter of days when this broadcast is going public. And also, they basically harassed those commentators who made some very negative comments about this new system. There's one professor from Tsinghua University in China who makes some critical comments about this system, and his access to internet was wiped out.
Jeez. If you play this out to its logical conclusion, you have a centralized kill switch. You've got everybody credentialed online using their face to be able to access anything. No government has that kind of control right now over the internet. What are the implications of something like that for their citizens going forward?
The implication is the establishment of a total and totalitarian cyber prison in China, where if you violate the rules set up by the government for you, and your entire internet ID will be eliminated. You will be gone. You'll become non-person, cyber-wise. So that's the problem. Because remember, China always has a social credit system. This is basically, the Chinese government said, one strike, you're out.
Yeah. Well, and how easy would it be to shut down the online voice of any kind of dissident who would ever disagree with the CCP? It'd be so easy.
Well, I think for all totalitarian regimes like China, they always know one thing very well. That is, either you have 100% efficiency or you don't have it at all. And they cannot really consider the alternative of not having censorship at all. And therefore, they're always going for the 100% efficiency. And that's what makes Chinese government model so scary, because once you're a totalitarian regime, the tendency toward total control of the population to do bad things, to go to the deep end, will be the only alternative.
Last question. You mentioned that they're in kind of a comments / feedback territory right now. Is there any world where this cyber ID doesn't get implemented?
There's no way. It's already going to put into implementation within a matter of a week.
Okay, so moving on, the big U.S. political news as of late is Kamala Harris's pick for VP, Tim Walz of Minnesota. And the next administration, Republican or Democrat, is going to have to face challenges from China. But actually, I'm from Minnesota, and I did not know his history of trips to China and his connections to China. So could you paint us that picture, give us the background on Walz and his ties there, and what that could mean if he were to be part of an incoming administration?
Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota is a person with a very substantial China connection. In 1989 and 1990, right about the time of the Tiananmen massacre, he was in China teaching English in the southern province of Guangdong. So he has some reflection on that. And after that experience, he and his wife set up some kind of exchange program. Each year, they send students to China. They have done that, for many, many decades, and until, I think, 2003. And altogether, Governor Tim Walz has made over 50 trips to China. So wow. He will be somebody who has a very substantial China experience. And not only that, he served on the Congressional Executive Committee on China, the CECC, which focuses on human rights in China. So he is considered as some kind of China head in the Congress, in the U.S. government. So this is very interesting. So, of course, this follows the long tradition of American presidential politics that has something to do with China.
Yeah, so you mentioned a long tradition. Let's go back. It sounds like there is a storied past of China hands in presidential administrations. Who would you start with?
Well, I would start with Thomas Jefferson, our third president. But the story went before he was a president of the United States in 1800. Thomas Jefferson, between 1794 and 1799, he was Continental Congress's ambassador to France. While he was in France, there was something else that happened. Just before his arrival in Paris, replacing Benjamin Franklin as America's top envoy to France, there was a British diplomatic mission, which is a huge mission, led by Lord George Macartney. That took place between 1792 and 1793. And Lord Macartney led a huge British diplomatic mission to China on the occasion of the Chinese Emperor Qianlong's 80th birthday. So the Macartney mission was very, very interesting because the purpose of this mission was to seek a friendly trade deal with the Chinese Empire of the Qin Dynasty. And the Qin Dynasty was at the zenith of its power. Emperor Qianlong was the most robust leader of the world at the time. So because of the magnificence and greatness of the Manchu dynasty, Qin dynasty, Emperor Qianlong was very arrogant and hubristic. He basically flat out rejected the British request to have a trade treaty and send them home and say, we are the country of great affluence. We don't need any trade with you smelly barbarians. So, and this was a quite humiliation for the British. This is then under the King George III, who had just lost the American colonies to the independent United States. Thomas Jefferson heard of this news, and he basically wrote a letter to Emperor Qianlong, and he said, Your Majesty, you're absolutely right by rejecting the British. for their request to have a trade treaty. British were no good. We just fought a war with them. How about you have a good trade treaty with the Americans? We're the good guys. We love the Chinese things, so we don't have any ill feeling toward China. So that was very interesting. Of course, Qianlong, so arrogant, he didn't bother to reply to Thomas Jefferson. But I found that later in the Jefferson archives, which is very interesting. Now, in the year 1807, President Thomas Jefferson imposed the embargo against all trading activities overseas. No merchant ship from the United States can be allowed. There was a Chinese merchant who lived in Philadelphia. He must send his goods back to China. So he begged the letter to Jefferson. He asked for exception. Jefferson was so interested in this guy, so he gave him exception. So that was very interesting. Just about that time, U.S.-China trade began to take shape. So the next president that has a substantial China connection was the 16th president, the greatest president of U.S. history, that is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was involved in the Civil War at the time, as we know, but he was very sympathetic to the Chinese immigrants to the U.S. Mostly they were in San Francisco area. There were Chinese coolies. So Lincoln equated the fate of Chinese coolies with that of the slaves in the South. So he sent one of the founding members of the Republican Party, a gentleman by the name of Anson Burlingame, to China as his minister to the Qin dynasty court. Now, a minister those days is equivalent to today's ambassador. So Ambassador Burlingame was such a good guy. He was very, very sympathetic to the Chinese. The Chinese loved him. When he retired, he was supposed to come back to the United States. But the Manchu court thought, this is a good guy. Why don't we just appoint him as a Chinese government's official representative to negotiate treaties with foreign countries? So that's what happened. So this American ambassador, former ambassador, was hired by the Manchu emperor and to represent the Manchu court to negotiate treaties on behalf of the Chinese government. Now, the government he had to deal with was the United States, first of all, Prussia, United Kingdom, Russia. Anson Burlingame was such a good friend to the Chinese court. When he died in 1870, by the way, on his way to St. Petersburg to negotiate a treaty with Russia on behalf of the Chinese government, he died of pneumonia. The Chinese government gave him an enormous reward and gave him a lot of decorations posthumously. So that is Anson Burlingame. Today, there is a city south of San Francisco named after him. That's the city of Burlingame, which is right next to the airport. If you fly to San Francisco, you will see the city of Burlingame, which is right next to the SFO. There are many other subsequent presidents also had a lot of China connections. One of the most obvious one was Ulysses Simpson Grant. Grant was the president for 2 terms right after the Civil War. And then after he stepped down from the White House, he actually went on a global tour. And he visited many countries. And in 1879, he visited China. And he arrived in China in early May, actually in late May 1879, and he visited 5 cities. And finally, on June 3rd, 1879, he arrived in Beijing, which is the capital of the Manchu dynasty at the time. And interestingly, Grant refused to see the Chinese emperor at the time, the Guangxu emperor, because he thought he was an autocrat. But he did agree to meet with Prince Gong, who is kind of a reformer, and also the de facto premier of China, a gentleman by the name of Li Hongzhang. Now, Li Hongzhang was widely credited for suppressing the Chinese rebellion known as the Taiping Rebellion, which also happened to end in 1864. So Mr. Li Hongzhang finds himself as an equal to great General Ulysses Grant for suppressing rebellions from the South. So that's why he had a great time over there. And Grant also was very amicable to Chinese request to be some kind of middleman between the Chinese government and the Japanese government over the issue of the Ryukyu Island, which is a part of the Okinawa chain today.
And this is fun. This is a true encyclopedia. Who's next?
Well, the next one was the procurator case of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is from Iowa, but he went to Stanford and got a degree in geology. And then he went on to work for a British company, which was then based in Australia. So in 1899, the 25-year-old Herbert Hoover, who just got married, was sent to Tianjin, China, to become a manager of the joint venture. It's called the Kaiping Mining Company, Kaiping 煤矿. A few months later, there was a huge outbreak of the xenophobic movement known as the Boxer Rebellion. So Herbert Hoover was almost caught by the Boxers and got killed, but he survived. While in China, he was in China for 3 years. He actually learned Chinese language, and he made a lot of money over there too. So Hoover used the money he made from China to become one of the greatest philanthropists in American history. And in 1928, of course, he ran for president as a Republican, and he won. So that's President Hoover.
And who would come up next?
Well, I think obviously we can skip many presidents, including FDR. But let's just say focus on Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon probably is the president. He was the first president who visited China while in office. And of course, Richard Nixon was credited for establishing this very long-lasting and profoundly influential U.S.-China bilateral relationship framework. I normally call it the framework 1972, which dominated U.S.-China relationship for the subsequent 50 years, almost half a century, until Donald Trump came along. We changed that. Richard Nixon, of course, was forced to step down almost exactly on this day, early August. He made the decision to step down on August 8th. Interesting about this three most significant American presidents that has a substantial China connection: Ulysses Grant, Herbert Hoover, and Richard Nixon. They were among the worst presidents in American history. In 1962, American historians got together to rank the 35 presidents up to that point. Ulysses Grant was ranked the second from the bottom, mostly for corruption under his administration. Now, historians always say Ulysses Grant himself was not corrupt. He was corrupted. Let's just put it that way. Hoover, of course, was notorious for being the most ineffective president to deal with the national crisis known as the Great Depression. And Richard Nixon, historians always rank him near the bottom, if not at the bottom, for the Watergate scandal. And he was the only president who was forced to step down while in office, to resign, that is. So I don't know whether there's a pattern or not, but it's just very telling. It's a historical anecdote of interest.
Is there a good modern example that would bring us to today?
Well, I don't know. I mean, hopefully Tim Walz will be the new fresh beginning and to distinguish himself as a non-scandal-ridden politician with substantial China experiences.
All right, so we'll close with news of unrest inside China's alliance structure. Most notably, protests broke out in Bangladesh against the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, which saw a government crackdown that killed roughly 300 protesters. Hasina eventually was forced to flee the country via helicopter. And then on the other side of the globe, we saw contested elections in Venezuela and protests there as well, all leading to government repression of dissidents and political opponents that's still ongoing. So is there any connection between all of these events in your eyes, Miles?
Well, I don't want to sound flippant on this issue, but if you look at the countries you just listed, Bangladesh, Venezuela, and I will also I'd like to add Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And then just over the weekend, last week, there was a huge anti-government protest in the nation of Hungary. Now, if you look at the four countries, Bangladesh, Venezuela, Sri Lanka, and Hungary, they were all the most concentrated targets of China's Belt and Road initiatives. That is, that the Chinese government has spent enormous money on those countries. And I don't know whether the domestic political chaos, political uprising has something to do with China connection I don't have any scientific evidence, but I see this is a very interesting coincidence. If you think about it, all these countries have some kind of semi-autocratic rulers, and they all took a lot of Chinese money. In the case of Bangladesh, the lady who was overthrown, Xi Jinping gave her $1 billion in aid. Now, those money, of course, was not 100% accountable. I think if you look at the uprising organizers in Bangladesh, they're predominantly students, young students, idealistic.
Very young.
They feel their government has failed them by aligning their nation with a notorious government like China. This is a similar situation. So wherever Belt and Road Initiative touches, you create domestic political instability. That's the point I'm trying to drive at. You look at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka probably is a classic example of how China's Belt and Road Initiative corrupts the society. Every single presidential election involves around central issue of its relationship with China. China is bankrolling that place, and China has heavy investment over there, trying to build Sri Lanka as some kind of satellite state of China. So, Venezuela, dictator Maduro is 100% in the Chinese pockets. So China financed and bankrolled him. China was the first country to recognize Maduro's illegitimate election result. So, and Hungary, of course, is even worse because Hungary is openly sided with Russia on the issue of Ukraine. So does China. And Hungary openly treats China as its friend. You can see this is basically, I think the people have spoken about their nation's own fate, about their nation's own cozy relationship with bad regimes like Chinese regime. So people essentially are rejecting the Chinese model of governance, and I firmly believe that.
Yeah, they're speaking up. And has China responded to any of these events?
China has, as I say, endorsed Maduro. China has condemned the West as the conspirator behind all these uprisings. China always paranoid about their own motive, how people perceive them.
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事。通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。